shortly after I became converted, that area of the world came to mind, communism, behind the Iron Curtain. And I just said, God, there's got to be a way to get there. When everybody else is going to Africa, why can't we go into Siberia? Considered the possibility of buying a ticket on the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Moscow to Beijing and getting about halfway through and throwing my passport out the window, pretending I was lost and possibly ending up in jail or some other thing, and being able to minister the gospel in Siberia that way.
Welcome to the Be Unbound Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
We are glad to welcome you back here. And I don't know, in one ways, David, this could be an extraordinary and ordinary podcast, but I don't really think it qualifies because David is past that as far as I'm concerned. There is no part of David Hazell that is, was, or ever will be normal. He is definitely extraordinary, but he does not hit the second part of that definition. And so this is just a straight up interview with somebody who thinks differently, who acts differently, and who gets different results from the rest of us. And that makes him very controversial in some circles in some ways. It also makes him extraordinarily effective. And we will see here as we begin this conversation and I intro and give the background on David, he's a man who's certainly been influential on us as well. And so we hope that you enjoy this very different type of conversation. And I absolutely know it will give you a different perspective and it'll give you a different understanding of some things. And you'll come away thinking different. Like it or hate it, you will definitely be impacted by this conversation. Well, David Hazell, welcome to the Be Unbound Podcast. It is my privilege and honor to introduce you to our guests. I think a lot of our listeners might already know you, but just in case, I'll just go back a little bit and say, I'm not sure exactly how many years ago it has been. I knew who David was. We had used his curriculum for our children in homeschooling, the My Father's World curriculum. And so I had attended several sessions. I'd seen David live at various conventions and conferences, but I was just a faceless person in the crowd there. And then I met him at a retreat, got to know him a little bit. And David went into a different category for me, which is of a very trusted mentor and somebody who has helped me in more ways than we would have time to talk about in this podcast. And that has happened informally in many, many ways and in many aspects of my life. And then formally, we have the just colossal privilege to count David as a member of our board for Unbound. And it is just as simple as this to say what Unbound does and who we are would not be possible without David Hazell. And so that's a high recommendation as far as we're concerned from the Be Unbound podcast staff. But in addition to that, there's been some really interesting things over the years. David, in addition to he and his wife Marie running My Father's World and a retreat center, Cabacona Hills, and some other businesses, I also know David as somebody who has had a pivotal role in Bible translation and a far bigger role than he is likely to want to admit or that most people realize. And also somebody who I think it was the first time I ever heard somebody talking about a reverse tithe where you give away 90% and keep 10. And so I would say a radical attitude towards giving and kingdom building that has challenged me, has pushed me out of my comfort zone, has taught me, and has really been a massive influence in my life. So David, with that preamble, I'm just delighted to have you on the podcast. Thanks for being.
Well, thank you for inviting me. That's very gracious for you to say those things. None of those things are possible without the God that created all of us and desires us to live the Ephesians 2:10 life that says to live out the things God has prepared in advance for us to do. And so our goal is to do that. Our goal has always been to do that. Just brief and very fast history. When I became a Christian at 18, I asked God to give me purpose. I felt that purpose would be to live an adventurous life in Siberia, Mongolia, and China. 14 years, fast forward 14 years later, 5, then 6 kids, and my family moves to Siberia and lives in Siberia for 4 years, Moscow in 4 years, being a part of Bible translation. That would we would call the first volume of our life. We feel like the Lord writes our life in volumes, and that was volume number 1. Before we actually moved to Russia, my wife had written a kindergarten program called My Father's World for a Christian school that she was at. And while we were in Russia, that took fruition and homeschoolers became interested in it. Specifically, Kathy Duffy wanted to put it in a book that she was writing in 1998. She had seen a rough draft of it from a convention we had gone to. And me being the entrepreneur that I am, and that I am a serial entrepreneur, no question about it, God has made me that. We all need to accept the things that God gives us. That's the most important thing of who we are. A humble person accepts both the gifts and the not gifts that the Lord has given us and uses them for his kingdom. And that's our goal. And so in 2000, we moved back to the US. We had already started My Father's World. That's a long story about how My Father's World got started while we're in Russia, just the miraculous things that the Lord did. But we hit the road running in 2000. We came back. My wife had a job in a school district for 1 year. And we said, I think we have just enough money to live our life 1 year at a time if we go all in every year. So for the next 9 years, it was all in with everything we had, all of our wealth, to create My Father's World. But one of the things we had prayed in Russia when we left to do this, we saw seen many needs, is that God would make us grossly profitable so we could be grossly generous. And we didn't really like the word nonprofit because nonprofits should be profitable. For those of that people that don't know that, nonprofits are not nonprofits at all. They are highly profitable entities that can be highly profitable entities that use all their money for great causes. So we made a decision to start My Father's World 1 year after another. So 2000 to 2000, roughly 13, writing one curriculum at a time. We successfully wrote pre-K through high school. I would say we wrote K through high school and then backed up and wrote preschool. About that time, the Lord began speaking to us about business for missions, or business for transformation, or I like to call Great Commission businesses, and a training center. And so we began praying about buying some land and building a training center. And we bought the land in 2011. And here we are now in 2023, and we're building a second lodge. It was a lodge on the property already. We're building a second lodge, and we trained our first family in 2020, sent a family with 4 kids to Kyrgyzstan, and we're assisting in helping build businesses in the country of Kyrgyzstan. And so that's like a raising view of everything that we're doing. The other thing I might say, in 2020, I was in Liberia when COVID hit, when Donald Trump said everybody should homeschool, when friends of mine were on the airplane with me from South Africa. They were pulled from the airplane and sent home. They weren't allowed to travel. And I knew at that moment that 2020 was going to be one of the biggest years for homeschooling. And so we prepared for that, and we tried to get our competitors to prepare in the same way. Honestly, we believe in collaboration, not competition. So we tried to collaborate and did collaborate with a few of our competitors, but we bought enough curriculum to really quadruple our business, and we're delivering materials. But what I learned through that is, yes, the students that study at home more than doubled, but that in the end settled down to probably about double now of what it was in 2019. But I would say only half of them are homeschoolers. The other half are temporarily schooling at home, waiting for a better solution. And so in the last 2 years, 3 years, we have begun really advocating and starting microschools. These are small one-room schoolhouses up to multi-classroom schoolhouses where multiple age children are meeting in the same class. And last record at the end of last year, I think we have 147 such schools around the US that are using My Father's World. And we are addressing that topic about every 8 weeks. We have an actual conference at our location. And the last conference, which was just a few days ago, we saw the initiation of probably another 8 to 10 schools. And we've been contacted with another 4 or 5 within the last week. So we're just rolling them out and doing what we can to help these schools get started.
Well, thanks, David. There's a lot to pick up on there, but I wanted to actually roll back to the very first part. So you said, I think the first thing you said was that you felt God had called you to an adventurous life. And I've heard you tell this story a couple times, and it has really struck with me. So would you share with our listeners, what your first two plans were for operating in Siberia? Because I think this gives a good job of indicating the kind of person you are, and it always tickles me to hear the story.
I have always loved to travel. I've always liked to think out of the box. When the Lord gives me something to do, and I just really felt like shortly after I'd been converted, that area of the world came to mind: communism, behind the Iron Curtain, behind the bamboo curtain, Mongolia. And I just said, God, there's got to be a way to get there. When everybody else is going to Africa, why can't we go into Siberia? And so considered the possibility of buying a ticket on the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Moscow to Beijing and getting about halfway through and throwing my passport out the window, pretending I was lost and possibly ending up in jail or some other thing, and being able to minister the gospel in Siberia that way. I don't know what kind of a crazy man I was at the time. I also consider parachuting over Tibet from to Nepal and dropping in, landing somewhere in the Tibetan mountains, and walking into China to get into the Tibetan areas. And in the end, the Lord said, settle down. Let's give you a family with 5 kids. Let's get you married. Let's get you settled. Let's make this adventure not go crazy. And so instead of being those crazy things, instead I just picked up 5 kids at the time, 6 eventually. And we moved from Southern California, where it was 70 degrees plus above zero, to Siberia 48 hours later with no baggage. And the temperature was minus 30 and all of our bags were lost. So that was less adventurous than by yourself across Trans-Siberian Railroad, I guess some people would say.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. There's some people that thinks that your second plan might have been crazier than your first, but I know I've met a lot of people. I don't know that I've met more people than average or anything, but I've met a lot of people across a lot of places. And David is absolutely the only person who has a mission mindset whose primary plan involved getting arrested in Siberia. And so I honestly think, David, that sort of story helps people understand everything else you say from a whole different perspective. At least it does me. And it's been one of my favorite stories I've ever heard. So I appreciate you indulging me with that.
Well, when I gave
So,
my life to Christ, and in my wife's and my vows were, we will go anywhere and do anything together for the King. And so that was like, I'm not going to sit around and be a Christian and sit on a pew. This doesn't make sense. The Bible doesn't talk about pew warming. I have zero interest in being a Christian pew warmer. If others are called to that, I don't think anybody is, but we'll wait till they get convicted from that position.
David, you characterize yourself like this, and I would say that it is a accurate characterization, which is a visionary, sometimes nearing prophetic in terms of being able to look around the corner and over the horizon and see what's coming. And you talked about that here at the end. And I think, based on the conversations that I have and the people that come and talk to me, there is your prediction and your assessment is exactly right. There's a lot of people homeschooling who are doing that because they've reached the point where they say public school is not viable. I'm not doing this. But I don't necessarily have homeschooling as my first love here, but this is the first stop, and I'd like a better solution. And you kind of alluded to the fact that there's a better solution for a lot of people in the sense of these microschools. Now, based on my understanding and also conversations with you, I've often described it to people and said, in many ways, the modern homeschooling movement is like the paratroopers and the pathfinders that went in ahead of the Normandy invasion. They took some key points, they seized some strategic assets, they established beachheads in a way that allowed the invasion to take place. And so the microschool movement runs off of the innovation, the free education market that's happened through homeschooling over the last generation. But that term is a squirrely one. It's one that gets a little confusing and has people kind of scratching their heads occasionally. So can we start there? You gave a description of a microschool as a multi-age schooling situation, but could you get a little bit more of a definition for people who are going,
Right.
okay, what are we talking about with
Well,
microschools?
before I do, I'd like you to find the other half of the people that are schooling at home.
Yeah, great.
You have homeschoolers and you have public school refugees.
Yes.
These are people that are escaping something for something better, and they'll land on any beach. And so they ended up landing temporarily on the beach of homeschooling. They're titled and called homeschoolers. Many of my homeschool friends, including leaders, are going to disagree with me, and I don't care. But the confidence I have is I interviewed other veterans. I realized in the 1960s, the same thing would have happened with other homeschoolers. I mean, that original homeschool movement, they would have been glad to go into a church or into a place with a biblical worldview that allowed prayer and let Bible be a part of the program. And really, honestly, the churches are called to educating all people in their church, including the children. And we will often say, when Jesus was asked by the people there, should we pay our taxes? The answer was, whose image is on this coin? And he says, give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. He did not need to say, but give unto God the things that are God's. Whose image is on our children? God's image. I think there can be a case made that because he was constantly telling people, let the children come to me. I think he was actually saying, we should not be given to Caesar the things that are God's. And that's what's happening when we send them to public school. And so we have to, as a church, as say the new Israel or the kingdom, the Lord was saying, raise your children always to know his word. And so now to define a microschool is simply two or more families working together to the same academic end using the same curriculum to accomplish the same task, meeting live in person 1 to 5 days a week. And sometimes it's 2, and sometimes it's as many as we're working with a group right now with 56 families and 156 kids. And so it can be anything. The difference between a school and a micro school, in our opinion, has to do with the need for multi-age classrooms, because second, third grade, fourth, fifth grade, whatever, they have to change curriculums every year. When you're a fifth grade and you teach fifth grade every year, then curriculum doesn't have to change and teacher doesn't have to change. But when you have third through fifth graders, you have to change the curriculum in that classroom every year for 3 years. Otherwise, you're going to have natural repeat. You're going to have people repeating the same topics. And then you have to, how do I handle and manage the next one? And my father's world was written to handle that. That's really the key.
So thanks, Dave. That's helpful. So let me just sort of say that back to you to make sure that I have understood it correctly. So your definition has a couple of different parts. The first would be a microschool is 2 or more families. So homeschooling, single family, microschool, multiple families working together. So they're assisting one another. And so people would say, well, hey, we're doing that and various things. We call them co-ops and all those kinds of things. You say, that's right. But they're meeting together for 1 to 5 days a week. So multiple days a week. And then a big differentiator here is that you have multi-age classrooms.
And you're using the same curriculum, both at the place and at home, unified together. Co-op is more enrichment. Yes, there's a science curriculum or an art curriculum, but all the other subjects are different. This way you could really support. It's almost like the other family should be able to substitute teach for you on any day you're sick.
So it's got a standardized, standardized, probably a poor word to use here. You have the same curriculum you're using.
Yes.
So yes, I think that's an important distinction. Co-ops are generally understood as we're doing our thing. We get together and do science. We're doing our thing. We get together and do art. And a micro school is like, we're doing all the same things, meaning that we're using the same curriculum. We have some universality here, which gives us some efficiency and some shared language and vocabulary and timing and all those kinds of things.
And we absolutely have some micro schools that almost do all the same thing, but they vary in math or they vary in language arts. But it's the minority where they vary, not the majority where they vary.
Are the micro schools defined by having any kind of paid staff, or is that more a function of how the school should be set up?
It's really a function of how the school has. We've got a one-room schoolhouse about 60 miles from here. 90% of the staff feel called by God not to be paid. And they only charge a very small, I think it's $200 to $250 a month to go there. And it's 5 days a week. I know another one where all the staff is fully paid. I know ones where none of the staff are paid. It's all volunteer. Some are nonprofits, some are for profits. There's a variety of ways. So the structure doesn't matter. If somebody wants a thorough understanding of a microschool, if you go to a website called publicschoolrescue.com, publicschoolrescue.com, and you watch my presentation called Rescue the Children. Another place you can go is our website, mfwbooks.com/rescue the children. If you go to that video, there's a long kind of 2-hour video. There's also 6 20-minute videos, which make the same videos, but chopped up. And it goes into how and why we do micro schools. It goes into every aspect. It goes into insurance. It goes into liability. It goes into payroll. It goes into raising grants, grant money. It goes into curriculum. It goes into why Bible was taken out of school. It gives a history of socialism penetrating our school system. And most people don't have any idea that this problem within our education system, the enemy looks at the long game. He plays the long game. He just sets things in motion over time. So what we're experiencing in our public schools today were set in motion not in the 1990s, not under Common Core and all these other things, not in the 1960s when prayer was removed, not in the 1930s when famous person from Princeton said standardized testing is so that we can make people feel like dunce and we can make them feel good with grades by lowering standards. Not in 1909 when John D. Rockefeller said, we don't need to educate these people to be intellectuals. We have enough of those. We need basically workers. Not back in the 1860s when Wisconsin Board of Education said children don't belong to their families, they belong to the school. Not even in the 1940s when Horace Mann said we should thank families for giving us hostages for our cause. But actually back in the 1820s when a man named Robert Owen started a community called Harmony in Indiana that eventually became the Frankfurt schools out of Germany, long story history, how he got it there, and became the core of communistic and Nazistic education. And then it was brought back to the United States by John Dewey and others.
So first of all, I think that's a good resource. I've been on that resource, and so I think people should go there. I would say, David, that when I'm talking to people, the almost the first question that they ask after they kind of grasp the concept of microschool is that if my church hosts this, does this make me a school? And if it does, then there's all these, does the state mean, do I have to file with the state? Do I have to register? Do I have to change my insurance? Do I have to do all those things? And so I would say that, I've had this conversation dozens and dozens of times over the last several months. And almost always the first set of 3 questions, that one's in there. So I know it's at publicschoolrescue.com. And so definitely go there for the full answer. But I think, for those listening, that's, my experience is it's going to be one of the first questions. And maybe you can head that one off at the pass.
Yeah. First of all, I think most of us don't understand anything before we start asking questions. The first thing that we do is we send people to a place. You can just search private school law and then your state. And it will always take you to a document of the Department of Education. In the state of Missouri, it says registration is not necessary, notification is not necessary, certification is not necessary, curriculum is not necessary, the number of days of the week you teach is not necessary. It just private school laws are private in many states, not all states. It's a state by state answer. So we want to send you there. Secondly, remembering that churches are under 2 constitutional amendments, one, a right to privacy, secondly, a right to religious freedom. So if we set ourselves up properly as a religious private school, that's another great possibility. The next one really is, well, what about liability? And then we say, well, here's 2 insurance companies that for $9 a month per child, you can add liability. However, most churches don't know that their existing liability insurance already covers a certain amount of children in the building at all times. So if you don't go over that number, there's no reason to change. So there's a lot of questions that are actually questions that we've been trained by our society that we have to ask. If I sell coffee, do I have to tell people it's hot? Yes, according to McDonald's law, and soon you have to tell people that coffee is hot. Okay. It's like, it's this whole lawfare and this whole idea. Micro schools are actually in what I call a liminal space. Liminal is a very interesting word. I love it. It's my favorite word on the face of the earth. Homeschools are over here. There's laws pertaining to homeschools. Schools are over here. There's laws pertaining to schools. There's no laws pertaining to this liminal space. Why do we want to ask people to give us laws? Just start the school. Okay. In Massachusetts, it's illegal to start a private school without going to the local public school board. So they're starting learning centers with mentors because there's no law for learning centers with mentors. Okay. We have forest academies starting. We have farm academies starting. We have Heartland Academy starting. We have all these different things. Academies don't have the same word as school in some states. I mean, it's this word, school. We have just spent the last 24 hours fighting our state who are currently voting on. We already have a law in the books that says home space school, which they intentionally did. Home space school is a school in all matters of state law they're trying to introduce in another bill. We believe they're doing it so that whatever laws they put on schools, they have to be followed by homeschool, whether that's vaccination, whether that's right to bear arms, whether that's anything else. They're basically saying, hey, we can't have a firearm within 1,000 meters of a school, and your home's a school, so therefore turn in your firearms, right? Look, there's a place when it's time for us to stand up and say we have constitutional rights. There are lawyers ready to fight for us if we will just get out there and teach our kids. Like, oh, I'm on a sinking ship. Let's discuss whether or not we should have gotten more lifeboats. And I don't want to get sued by putting the wrong kids on the lifeboat, so I'm just going to let them all drown. Okay. It's like, you can't have these conversations. They don't make sense. You don't have a burning building and discuss your fire alarms. You rescue children and then you process it afterwards. And this is what we're doing. Yesterday's phone call, a local school district, middle of the country, red state, Missouri, where the stories are horrific regarding rape and fondling and all of these other things within the public schools of this small rural school. It's happening everywhere.
So, David, we talked about microschools and we wanted to talk about that, but you also mentioned something in your introduction when you talked about business's mission. And then you said the term that you used that you preferred was Great Commission businesses. And I think this is one of the things that I have been inspired by and listened to you talk about a lot, which is, I tell people folks are in business for all kinds of different reasons. And the general perception is that most people are in business because they want to become super rich or something like that. And that's certainly true for some people. But that does not have to be the only reason to be in business. And you have been really clear about talking about you started business, even the story you told here is that you came back. I think the term you used was to be grossly profitable so you could be grossly generous. And so, again, like we do with microschools, when you say Great Commission business, put a little flesh on those bones. What does that mean?
Well, my personal opinion is that every nonprofit should have businesses that are supporting it. And those businesses can be run by people that care and are making this happen. One of the reasons we run businesses is so that we could fund Bible translation. We made a decision to fund hundreds of thousands of dollars towards Bible translation through the profits of our business. We've decided that we would buy land and build training centers based on the profits of our business. We've decided that we would help other countries start businesses so that the local people who have ministry in churches in those places, that they would be able to run their churches, they would be able to run without having to ask for a handout. We've got a particular micro school in Mississippi where the woman buys real estate intentionally. She gives a corner of the real estate to a micro school. That micro school runs. She rents out the rest of the building. It funds the entire micro school, and she moves on and thinks about duplicating it. And what we really believe is that Great Commission businesses are businesses who could think about the Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations. It doesn't mean just giving away money. It means giving away the word. It means having ways to fund people. It's not like every man's an island, right? Which is the way missions has worked since the 1960s. And here, every man's an island. Like, give me some money, I'll go spend it, and then I'll come back and get some more money from you, right? And it's like, no, why don't you? Why don't I teach you how to fish in that other country? So we have feed stores on the Silk Road, and within 15 months, less than 15 months, actually, our target was 15 months. 4 of them made it in less than 6 months. 4 of them in 9 to 10 months. 4 of them are floundering. We became break even and making a profit on a container sitting on the Silk Road selling chicken feed. And because they were driving hundreds of miles to go get chicken feed. Well, okay, we'll bring the chicken feed to you. We'll mark it up and we'll sell it to you. And therefore, we're giving jobs to pastors who can then live in their communities instead of having to run to Russia as a migrant worker because they became a Christian in a Muslim country. And they have to go to a non-Muslim country to get a job because their job has been taken away from them by their Muslim neighbors. Well, we're now turning that and flipping on its head, making the pastor one of the best resources for the best chickens and the best eggs in the community. And guess who's coming to them? All the Muslims are coming to them and say, how do I do this? They're demonstrating, they're discipling the neighbors in business. And through discipling business, they learn about other things. So to us, a Great Commission business is a business that runs for the purpose of growing the kingdom of God. Now, I don't know anybody whose business shouldn't be a Great Commission business, because every business in America, if we're a Christian, should be discipling their employees, should be discipling their retailers, should be discipling their customers, at least when they're in a person-to-person relationship with them. It's not a business transaction, so I can go off and do something different. We're called to make disciples of all nations.
Well, thank you, David. I've heard you explain that several times. It never fails to light a bit of a fire in my belly. And I think that last part is perhaps I'd like to take that and sort of snap it together with something you said with Microschools. And so the last part there you said was that I don't see any reason why any business cannot be a Great Commission business. And so to some extent, that's a charge and a challenge in saying removing excuses here, right? I mean, so there's an opportunity to do something immediately and to think about what the purpose of your profits are, what the purpose of your business is, and to think of that, I think, in a more creative and inventive way. And then to couple that sort of immediate action with the immediate action of, I thought you had a powerful analogy. If the ship is sinking, we're not going to argue about whether it's against regulations to put extra people in the lifeboat. And we have a situation here where there was a crisis in terms of the people's reaction to the pandemic. And then all of a sudden people had this awareness and there was a transparency in terms of what's going on in schools. And all of a sudden you have people looking for a lot of alternatives, and homeschooling paved the way and took some strategic points. And so if you are in that camp of looking for something different and you're looking for a way to do this, and you say, I think there's a way that pull these pieces together, definitely go to publicschoolrescue.com and check out what they've got there. Think carefully about what David said here. And I think if you get this all working right, you have churches who provide opportunities for children to learn, to grow, to start businesses who are Great Commission businesses that turn around, who fund more schools. And you're looking at a cultural revolution and the kind that brings prosperity and human flourishing in the places where it happens. And I think that's what keeps me working at Unbound. That's what keeps me excited and getting up every day. And that's what keeps me optimistic and excited about the future. So, David, thanks for coming and being on the Be Unbound podcast. Thanks for your work that you're doing with Microschools and with homeschoolers and with Bible translation, and the list goes on and on. And honestly, that kind of vision and that kind of action is exactly what we would expect from somebody whose initial battle plan was to get arrested in Siberia. So thank you.
Well, that was a young person's dream of the way you're a Christian, if you're going to obey his discipleship call. But anyway, I'm more mature now. I still may get arrested, but I'm more mature in how I'll go about it. All right.
Maybe not in Siberia. So
All right.
thank you, Dave. Appreciate
God bless you.
Take care. All right, David. We've had two Davids on the podcast, so I've been
Both from Missouri as well.
both from Missouri. Yeah, you're not that far away from David Hazell.
No, actually, no. I went to grad school just down the road from him.
Right. Is it an hour and a half that where you live?
From where I am currently, yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. So, well, as I talked about in the introduction, David Hazell is not ordinary. I'm so glad he shared that story about his original, plan for missionary work, because I think that just if you understand that about David, you understand almost everything else that comes afterwards. But David is somebody who does things differently, and because of that, as I mentioned in the intro, he gets different results. And I don't know if the numbers sort of sailed past there, but microschools weren't really a thing 2 years ago, and David's sitting on 150 already established, and a solid shot at doubling that this year. And so you talk about sort of rapid growth in a place that requires a lot of work. That doesn't happen without a lot of vision, without a lot of work, and with a lot of infrastructure behind it. And so David's the man to do those kinds of things. So I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
David Hazell, any takeaways that you have from this conversation?
Yeah, I think just the main thing from hearing him talk about things is just that he is just somebody who I think just does so much better of a job than I think the vast majority of people that I think I have ever met, at least, of acting upon what he believes to be true and just following through on it to the furthest extent. And, there's a good chance that you may end up disagreeing with him on some of the things and some of his conclusions, but you absolutely cannot say that he does not follow through on the things that he talks about. I do think back to our conversation with Andrew Pudawa, where we had a little bit of a conversation about just like, it's natural for us to be convicted about not acting in with what we believe, but I think David is somebody who I'm sure still struggles with that in some ways, but I think is an encouragement for us to be able to look and see like, hey, it is absolutely possible with the power of God working through us to be able to go and act and do in accordance with what we believe.
It's one thing to have passion. It's another thing to have passion over a lifetime that you keep compounding. And I think David stands out so much is that, when I met David first, he was a very passionate person. He is an even more passionate person now. And that's not always the case. Sometimes people's, exhaustion burns them out. Sometimes other things sidetrack them. And David's somebody who, keeps going after and keeps expanding his vision and keeps deepening his capability of carrying out that vision. And that's both admirable and rare. It's interesting. We talked to David. He has a lot of things that would kind of match with our conversation with Joe Denner. Joe talked about, using business as ministry, but it's interesting that at two different ends of it. Joe talks about like how you can make the workplace a ministerial place in the sense and how you treat other people and how you take care of your people and how you help your people in a system, all of which is true. And I think David would be completely on board with that. But David kind of came from the other end, which is how do you use your business to further the kingdom? To think of your business not so much as a business in and of itself, but as a thing that generates profit and generates and creates value that you then can turn around and fold back into different things. He said something that I didn't pick up on. Well, I listened to, but we didn't have time to kind of really delve into in the conversation. And that was every nonprofit should have a bunch of profitable businesses attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't mean the nonprofit owns those businesses or any kind of wonky situation like that. He's saying that, when you're a nonprofit, you tend to think of donors and you tend to think of individuals. I know from experience, David doesn't think that way. David thinks of a nonprofit associated with businesses that are generating profit specifically to fund that nonprofit in a way that is sustainable for everybody involved. And I think that's an intriguing way to look at things. And again, it's not that other people don't think the same things is that David thinks about it from a different perspective, and one that ends up exponentially going deeper, farther, and wider. And that's the way he thinks. And if you are around him for any level of time, you'll start to pick up on that and learn from it. And it's a pretty exciting thing. Well, David, we've got a lot of connections to David Hazell, which we appreciate. I mentioned that our family has used My Father's World curriculum for our children, so I
Hmm.
can personally attest and endorse the education curriculum. So if you are a homeschool family and you're looking for a curriculum, I can personally attest that the My Father's World curriculum is extraordinary and exceptional.
I can also vouch for that because my family used it pretty much all the way through high school for me as well. So that's 2 sign-ons for here.
So there you go. If you know David Rethemeyer or any of my children, you can then decide for yourself whether My Father's World is where you want to go or not. We actually have several staff members who have used My Father's World, and of course, we have lots of friends who've used it as well. So I just think, in terms of high quality curriculum, right up there, if not at the top. It's not just the quality of the curriculum, which is certainly there. It's the comprehensiveness of it, and it's the fact David's wife Marie. I think that when we were there last, she told us that she had read and reviewed 40,000 books over the years in preparing and constantly honing and refining and updating their curriculums. And so it is a mind boggling amount. Her personal library is mind bogglingly large. And to be able to look at that, it's easy to say, she can point to any book on the shelf and say, I read that, it's this, and it's this. And so just a tremendous amount of research goes into that. And then also, if you're interested in the microschools aspect of it, you definitely need to go to My Father's World website. We'll have that in the show notes, as well as Public School Rescue, which we'll have in the show notes, and check those things out. And then, in terms of Unbound, our staff coaches the My Father's World high school curriculum. So if you're looking for a high school curriculum for your high schooler, we certainly heavily endorse and recommend My Father's World. So we would love for you to use that. But if you're looking for some help in doing that, our Declare program integrates everything from our Equip program for high schoolers, but with personal coaching specifically for the My Father's World high school curriculum and platform. And so you have somebody who knows all of the subjects, who knows all of the ways that it works, and provides an accountability structure, a reporting structure, assistance to groups going through that. So if your student's in a homeschool student in My Father's World high school curriculum, you get to join a team of students, you get to have an Unbound coach, and you get access to not only the My Father's World curriculum, but the kinds of things that we do inside of our high school curriculum as well, integrated into one package. And obviously, for biased reasons, we're a big fan of that situation. But we're a big fan of that, of course, but also because we have such tremendous testimonials coming out of that, of students and families who talk about not just the quality of the curriculum, but the camaraderie that they have from working with other students, the assistance they have from our coaches. And we can just attest that we have some really cool students in those programs. And I think some just absolutely top flight coaches running through that. Anything else that we should mention, Dave, before we wrap up for this episode?
If you want to learn about any of our programs in addition to the Declare program, and if you want to hear about how we have a different approach to education, also visit our website, beunbound.us, and check us out if you have somebody who has just graduated from high school and if you're looking for an alternative option for them as well.
In so many ways, this is a golden age for alternative forms of education. You've had an educational free market created by the homeschool movement that has been active for a generation now, 30, 40 years. And it continues to refine, hone, and invent better and more efficient and more creative and more interesting ways to teach students the things that they need to learn. My Father's World is an absolutely phenomenal example of that. But you should just pause. And for everything going wrong in the world, this little corner of the world is going really well. There's some really awesome opportunities out there. There's some really fantastic resources, and there are people like David who are blazing the way. And so maybe a little note of hope to end our podcast today. And until we see you next time, be unbound.